4 minutes of silence can sound exactly like the end of a life, until one breath changes everything. The monitor gave a long, unbroken tone, flat and final, the kind every paramedic in America recognizes without needing to look twice, and Lucas Reed had heard it more times than he could count over 8 years on the job. But something about this room felt wrong before he even checked the time. The air was too still, the expensive marble floors too clean. The man standing in the corner too composed for someone who had just called 911 saying his pregnant wife had stopped breathing. And when Lucas stepped closer, kneeling beside Emily Whitmore, he noticed the smallest details first, the kind training teaches you to trust, the faint warmth still clinging to her skin, the barely perceptible movement beneath her ribs, the second rhythm that didn't belong to panic or fear but to something quieter, something fighting to stay, and he hesitated for half a second, just enough for instinct to override protocol. "Hold on," he said, more to himself than anyone else, while the husband, Daniel Whitmore, a name Lucas recognized from headlines and charity galas, shifted his weight and ran a hand through perfectly styled hair, his voice controlled, almost rehearsed, explaining that she had collapsed suddenly, that everything had happened too fast, that he had tried to help. But Lucas wasn't listening anymore because the silence from the monitor didn't match what he was feeling under his fingertips, and in this job, when something doesn't match, you don't ignore it, you lean in. The house around them told a different story than the one being spoken, framed photos of smiling vacations, a nursery half finished down the hall, soft pastel colors waiting for a life that hadn't even begun yet, and for a split second, Lucas imagined the future that was supposed to exist here. Birthdays, laughter, small footsteps on polished floors, all of it balanced on the fragile line between one breath and none. "Starting compressions," his partner said, but Lucas shook his head slightly, adjusting his position, focusing instead on that faint, stubborn signal. Because sometimes the body doesn't follow the script people expect, sometimes it pauses, waits, fights in ways machines can't immediately read, and he had learned the hard way that giving up too early is a mistake you carry forever. Behind him, Daniel's voice cracked. Just enough to sound believable, asking if she was gone, asking what happens next, asking questions that filled the room but didn't quite land, and Lucas answered none of them, because he was watching Emily's face, pale but not empty, still holding something that refused to disappear, and then it happened, so small it could have been missed if anyone blinked, a subtle shift, a breath that wasn't there a second ago. A whisper of life returning where silence had settled, and Lucas froze, not from fear but from recognition, the kind that sends a chill down your spine because you know you're witnessing something that doesn't happen often, something that doesn't fit neatly into reports or explanations, and for the first time since he entered the room, the story began to change, not in words, but in the quiet, undeniable truth of a body that refused to stay still when it was supposed to be gone. Lucas Reed had learned to trust the moments that did not make sense, and this was one of them, because the monitor still showed a flat line yet beneath his hand there was a faint resistance, a quiet refusal that did not belong to someone who was truly gone, and then it came again, a shallow inhale, uneven and fragile, like a match trying to stay lit in the wind. And his head snapped up as he locked eyes with his partner who had already reached for the equipment to confirm what they were both starting to realize. "She is not gone," Lucas said, his voice low but certain, and the words shifted the entire room, breaking whatever illusion had settled there, because Daniel Whitmore stepped forward too quickly, his expression flickering for just a second before settling back into concern, asking how that was possible, asking if they were sure. But Lucas did not answer him directly, not yet, because his focus stayed on Emily. On the slow return of something that should not have come back so easily. The stretcher wheels clicked sharply against the marble floor as they moved her, the sound echoing through the hallway lined with wealth and perfection, and Lucas could feel the contrast pressing in on him, the polished surfaces, the quiet luxury, the life that looked flawless from the outside, none of it matching the strange stillness that had filled that room just minutes earlier. Inside the ambulance, the doors slammed shut with a heavy finality, sealing them into a different world where every second mattered and every detail spoke louder than words, and as the siren cut through the night, Lucas adjusted the oxygen mask, watching closely as Emily's chest rose again, slightly stronger this time, not steady, not safe, but present, undeniably present. Then he noticed something else. Something that made him pause even as his hands kept moving. The monitor picked up a second rhythm, faint but distinct, a separate pattern layered beneath the first, and Lucas felt his throat tighten as recognition settled in. Because this was not just one life fighting to return, there were two, and suddenly the stakes shifted in a way that made everything heavier, every decision sharper, every second more urgent. "She is pregnant," his partner said quietly, confirming what the machine had already revealed, and Lucas nodded once, his eyes never leaving the readings, because now the question was not just how she had come back, but what had brought her to that edge in the first place, and why the story they were given did not seem to fit the reality unfolding in front of them. He replayed the scene in his mind, the husband's calm voice, the lack of visible panic, the perfectly timed call, the way the room had felt before any words were spoken, and a quiet unease settled deeper in his chest, not loud, not dramatic, but persistent, the kind that does not go away once it arrives. Emily's fingers twitched slightly against the blanket, a small movement that might have meant nothing to anyone else, but to Lucas it felt like a signal, like a message that had not yet been spoken, and he leaned closer, lowering his voice as if she could hear him through the haze, telling her to stay, to keep fighting, even though he did not fully understand what she had just survived. Outside, the city lights blurred past in streaks of white and gold, the ambulance cutting through intersections, carrying more than just a patient, carrying a question that had no clear answer yet, and as Lucas glanced once toward the closed doors, toward the world they had just left behind, one thought settled in his mind with quiet certainty: this was not a simple emergency, and whatever truth was hidden in that house had not stayed there. The ambulance doors burst open into a flood of white light as the emergency team rushed forward, voices overlapping, wheels rattling across polished hospital floors, and Lucas Reed stayed close as they transferred Emily Whitmore onto the hospital bed, his eyes still locked on the monitor, as if looking away might break whatever fragile thread was holding her there. Female, late 20s, approximately 7 months pregnant, unresponsive on arrival but regained spontaneous breathing en route, he reported, his voice steady but edged with something he could not quite name, because even as he spoke, his mind was still back in that house, replaying every detail that did not sit right. The doctors took over with practiced efficiency, hands moving fast, lights glaring down, machines attaching, numbers filling the air like a language only they fully understood, and Lucas stepped back just enough to give space but not enough to disconnect. Because something in him refused to treat this as routine. Emily's eyelids fluttered, not fully open, not fully closed, caught somewhere between presence and absence, and for a brief second, her lips moved, barely noticeable, as if she was trying to form a word that had not yet found its way out, and Lucas leaned in slightly, instinct guiding him again, listening for something that might not even be there. "You are safe," a nurse said gently, though no one in that room could guarantee that yet, and the words seemed to hang in the air. Uncertain, fragile, like everything else about this moment. Then the monitor shifted again, that second rhythm becoming clearer, stronger, a steady reminder that this was not just one life being pulled back from the edge, and the room adjusted accordingly, more urgency, more focus, more weight behind every action, because now the stakes had doubled without warning. Outside the trauma bay, the automatic doors slid open once more, and Daniel Whitmore appeared, his presence almost too composed for the chaos around him, speaking quickly to a staff member, asking for updates, his voice carrying just enough strain to sound convincing, but Lucas watched him from across the room, and the unease that had started in the house did not fade, it sharpened. There was something about the way Daniel stood, not close enough to reach for her, not far enough to seem detached, perfectly positioned in a space that felt calculated rather than emotional, and Lucas had seen real panic before. He knew what it looked like, what it sounded like, and this was not it. A doctor stepped out to speak with Daniel, explaining the situation in careful terms: unstable condition, critical monitoring, both patients requiring immediate attention, and Daniel nodded at all the right moments, asking the right questions, playing the role expected of him. But Lucas noticed the pauses, the slight delays before responses, the way his eyes flickered not toward Emily but toward the equipment, the staff, the process, as if measuring something invisible. Back inside, Emily's fingers moved again, this time more deliberate, brushing weakly against the hospital sheet, and Lucas felt that same pull to step closer, to stay connected to whatever she was trying to hold on to, and for a brief moment, her eyes opened just enough to reveal a fragment of awareness. Not clarity, not strength, but something unmistakable, recognition, and her gaze did not search the room randomly, it fixed for a split second in his direction, as if she knew he was there, as if she was trying to say something without the ability to form the words. Then her lips parted again, and this time there was a sound, faint, broken, barely audible over the noise of machines and movement. But Lucas caught it, a single word shaped more by breath than voice, and it was not a name, not a cry for help, but something else, something that made his chest tighten as he realized this was not over, not even close, because whatever had happened before she arrived here was still following her, still present, still waiting to be understood. The word barely formed on Emily's lips did not sound like a plea or a name, it sounded like a warning, soft and fractured but deliberate enough to stop Lucas Reed from stepping away, and he leaned closer, lowering his voice as the noise of the trauma bay surged around them. "You are okay, you are in the hospital," he said carefully, watching for any sign of recognition, any flicker that might confirm she was still connected to this moment, and for a brief second her eyes shifted again. Unfocused but searching, as if trying to anchor herself to something real before slipping back into the haze. The machines continued their steady rhythm, numbers stabilizing by inches. Not miles, progress so small it could be missed if you were not paying attention, but Lucas was paying attention to everything now, not just the readings but the spaces in between, the pauses, the inconsistencies that did not belong. Behind him, voices lowered as a nurse stepped closer to the attending physician, whispering something about marks that required documentation. About protocols that needed to be followed when a situation did not match the initial report, and Lucas felt that quiet tension ripple outward, subtle but unmistakable, the kind that turns a routine case into something else entirely. Outside the glass doors, Daniel Whitmore remained in view, pacing just enough to appear restless, checking his phone, speaking in hushed tones to someone on the other end, his posture controlled, his movements measured, and Lucas noticed the way he never once tried to step closer when the doors opened, never reached out, never asked to see her directly, as if proximity was something he was carefully avoiding. "Sir, we may need to ask you a few more questions," a hospital staff member said gently, and Daniel nodded with immediate cooperation, offering answers that sounded complete but somehow felt rehearsed, timelines that lined up too neatly, explanations that filled gaps before anyone had even asked about them, and Lucas felt that same unease tighten, because real panic does not organize itself that quickly, real fear does not arrive already polished. Back inside, Emily's hand moved again, this time gripping weakly at the edge of the blanket, and Lucas saw it clearly, the intention behind it, not random, not reflex, but purposeful, and he stepped closer once more, lowering himself so that his voice would not carry beyond her. "You are safe here," he repeated, slower now, giving each word space to reach her, and her breathing shifted in response, still uneven but no longer drifting, as if she was trying to follow the sound of something steady. Then it happened. Again, her lips parting, forming another broken attempt at speech, and Lucas held still, listening carefully, because this time there was more clarity, not enough for a full sentence, but enough for a direction, a meaning that did not belong to confusion, and when the sound finally came through, faint but unmistakable, it carried a single idea that sent a quiet chill through him, not because it was loud, but because it was certain. It was not about what had already happened, it was about what might happen next, and Lucas straightened slightly, his focus shifting beyond the bed for the first time since they arrived, his eyes moving toward the glass doors where Daniel stood waiting, because in that moment, something settled into place with a clarity he could not ignore. This was not just a case of someone fighting to come back. This was someone trying to make sure they were not sent back into the same danger. And whatever truth was buried between those walls had not been left behind, it had followed them here, quiet, patient, and waiting to be heard. Lucas Reed did not step away this time, even as the room shifted around him with new instructions, new urgency. Because what Emily had just tried to say lingered in the air between them, fragile but undeniable, and he had learned that moments like this were not random, they were signals, small openings where the truth tried to surface before being buried again. A nurse approached with a clipboard, speaking in a careful tone about standard procedures, about documentation, about ensuring the patient felt secure, and Lucas nodded without breaking his focus, because security was no longer just a word in this room, it was a question that had not yet been answered. Beyond the glass, Daniel Whitmore remained in place, now speaking with a hospital administrator, his posture still controlled, his voice still measured, and Lucas noticed something else, something subtle but telling. The way Daniel's attention shifted every time a staff member moved toward the trauma bay, as if he was tracking access rather than concern, watching who went in and out instead of what was happening inside. "We should limit visitors for now," the attending physician said, and the decision settled quickly, almost naturally, but Lucas felt the weight behind it, because sometimes restrictions are not just about medical necessity, they are about buying time, about creating space for something to be understood before it is interrupted. Emily's breathing steadied another fraction, still fragile, still uneven, but no longer slipping away, and Lucas saw her hand tighten again around the blanket, a small but deliberate action that carried more meaning than any words she could not yet form, and he leaned closer once more, lowering his voice to something steady, something she could hold onto. "You are not alone," he said, each word placed carefully, and this time her response was clearer, not in sound but in intention, her eyes opening just enough to meet his again, holding for a second longer than before, as if she was choosing to stay present despite the pull trying to take her under. Then her lips moved again, slower, more controlled, and Lucas stayed still, listening, because now there was a pattern forming. Not random attempts but focused effort, and when the sound finally came through, faint but shaped with purpose, it was enough to shift everything, not a full sentence, not even a complete word, but a direction, a warning that pointed beyond her and towards something waiting outside this room. Lucas straightened slightly, his gaze moving once more toward the glass doors, toward the figure who had not left, and the unease that had followed him from that house settled into something more solid. Something closer to certainty, because this was no longer about doubt or instinct alone, it was about connection, about the way her reactions aligned with his observations, two separate threads beginning to form the same picture. A hospital security officer appeared near the entrance, called quietly by a staff member who had noticed the same inconsistencies, and the atmosphere shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to signal that this situation was no longer contained within routine boundaries. Daniel glanced toward the movement, his expression tightening for just a fraction of a second before smoothing over again, and Lucas caught it, that brief crack in the performance, the moment where control slipped just enough to reveal something underneath. Inside the room, Emily's grip loosened slightly as exhaustion pulled at her again, but her eyes did not fully close this time, they lingered, half open, anchored to the present in a way that felt intentional. As if she was holding on not just for herself but to make sure something was seen. Something was understood before it was too late, and Lucas remained where he was, no longer just a responder, no longer just a witness, but someone who knew that whatever story had started before this night was not finished, and that the next part would not unfold quietly. The presence of security did not change the volume of the room, but it changed its gravity, shifting the balance in a way that could not be reversed, and Lucas Reed felt it immediately, the subtle tightening of conversations, the careful choice of words, the awareness that every movement now carried weight beyond routine procedure. The officer remained near the entrance, not intrusive, not confrontational, just present, and sometimes presence alone is enough to alter the direction of a story, especially when that story has not yet been fully told. Daniel Whitmore noticed him too, of course he did, and for the first time since arriving, his attention broke from its controlled pattern, lingering just a fraction longer on the uniform, on the quiet authority it represented, and Lucas saw it clearly, the shift behind the calm exterior, small but real, like a crack forming beneath polished glass. Inside the room, the doctor's voice lowered as instructions were given, Not just about treatment, but about observation. About documenting everything carefully, about making sure nothing was overlooked, and Lucas stepped back only enough to allow space while still remaining within reach, because leaving entirely no longer felt like an option. Emily's condition held steady, not improving dramatically, not declining, balanced in that narrow space where time stretches and every second feels longer than it should, and her breathing, though assisted, had found a rhythm that suggested determination rather than surrender. Lucas watched her closely, noticing the way her eyes no longer drifted aimlessly but seemed to return again and again to the same point in the room, as if anchoring herself to something constant, and he realized that point was not a place, it was a person, him, the only one who had been there from the moment everything changed, the only one she had seen when she crossed back from that silence. "We are going to keep you here for observation," the doctor said gently, more for reassurance than comprehension, and Emily's fingers tightened slightly in response, another small signal. Another piece of a pattern that was becoming harder to ignore. Outside, Daniel's conversation grew quieter, his body angled away from the doors now, as if distance could reduce attention, as if stepping slightly out of view might return control to him. But control does not return once it begins to slip, and Lucas knew that better than most, because he had seen it before in situations where the truth arrives slowly. Not in a single moment but in a series of small, undeniable pieces. A nurse approached Lucas briefly, her voice low, asking if anything unusual had been observed at the scene, and he paused just long enough to choose his words carefully, not exaggerating, not assuming, but not dismissing what he had felt either, describing the inconsistencies, the timing, the atmosphere that had not matched the explanation given, and the nurse nodded, her expression tightening in quiet understanding before she stepped away to relay that information further. Down the line, back inside, Emily's lips moved again, and this time Lucas did not hesitate, leaning closer immediately, because the effort was clearer now, the intention stronger, and when the faint sound reached him, it carried more shape than before, more direction, enough to form the beginning of something that could no longer be ignored, a warning that was trying to become a statement. Lucas glanced once more toward the doors, toward the man waiting beyond them, and for the first time since the night began, the pieces did not just feel disconnected or suspicious, they began to align, forming a quiet but undeniable conclusion that settled heavily in his chest, because whatever had happened before that ambulance arrived was not an accident waiting to be explained, it was a truth waiting to be uncovered, and now there were too many people paying attention for it to remain hidden for much longer. The shift from suspicion to action did not happen loudly, it happened in quiet decisions made behind half-closed doors, in brief conversations that ended with a nod instead of a conclusion, and Lucas Reed could feel it unfolding even without hearing every word, because the room itself had changed, no longer just focused on saving a life but on understanding how that life had been pushed to the edge. A senior nurse stepped into the hallway and spoke directly to the security officer, her tone calm but precise, and within seconds another presence joined them, a hospital administrator who carried authority not through volume but through certainty, and Lucas recognized the pattern, the escalation that only happens when something crosses from medical into legal, from care into investigation. Inside the room, Emily Whitmore remained at the center of it all, her condition holding in that fragile balance, but her awareness sharpening in small, undeniable ways, her eyes opening longer now, her breathing responding more clearly when spoken to, and Lucas stayed close enough that his voice could reach her without strain, grounding her with simple words that required no strength to understand. "You are safe here," he repeated, steady, consistent, and this time her response came not just in movement but in focus, her gaze locking onto his with a clarity that had not been there before, and for a brief moment, the noise of the room seemed to fade, leaving only that connection, that silent exchange where meaning passed without needing full sentences. Her lips moved again, slower, more deliberate, and Lucas leaned closer, not rushing, not interrupting, giving her the space to form what she needed to say, and when the sound finally came through, it carried enough shape to be understood, a single word that did not belong to confusion or fear but to recognition, and it pointed outward, beyond the bed, beyond the machines, towards someone else. Lucas did not react immediately. But inside, everything aligned because that word matched the unease. Matched the inconsistencies, matched the feeling that had followed him since the moment he stepped into that house. Outside the glass doors, Daniel Whitmore's posture had shifted again, less composed now, more contained, as if holding something in place rather than projecting control, and when another staff member approached him with questions, his answers came a fraction slower, his tone slightly less certain. Subtle changes that most people would miss, but not Lucas, not now. A quiet instruction was given, and the security officer adjusted his position, no longer just observing but ensuring that the flow of movement remained controlled, that access to the room was limited and deliberate, and Daniel noticed, of course he noticed, his eyes narrowing for just a second before smoothing over again. But that second was enough to confirm that the balance had shifted away from him, back inside. Emily's hand moved once more, this time reaching slightly outward, not toward the equipment, not toward the staff, but toward Lucas, a small gesture that carried more weight than any statement, and he responded without hesitation, placing his hand near hers without pressure, without force, just enough to let her know he was there, that she was not alone in whatever she was trying to hold on to. Her grip tightened briefly, a silent confirmation, and then her eyes closed again, not in surrender but in exhaustion. As if she had used the last of her strength to deliver something that mattered, something that could not wait. Lucas remained still, watching the monitors, listening to the steady return of rhythm, but his focus had already expanded beyond the bed, beyond the immediate moment, because now there was direction, now there was connection, and whatever came next would not be about guessing anymore. It would be about proving what had already begun to surface, quietly but undeniably. The word Emily had formed lingered in Lucas Reed's mind long after her eyes closed again, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it had direction, and direction meant intention, and intention meant she was not just reacting to what had happened, she was trying to point towards something that still mattered. Outside the trauma bay, the quiet escalation continued as a second security officer arrived, not rushing, not drawing attention, but positioning himself with purpose, creating a boundary that had not existed before, and Daniel Whitmore noticed it immediately, his posture stiffening for a fraction of a second before he adjusted, stepping slightly to the side as if giving space, as if cooperating without being asked. A hospital administrator approached him again, this time with a tone that carried more structure, asking for clarification on the timeline, on the sequence of events leading up to the emergency call, and Daniel answered. Of course he did, his voice controlled, his words measured, but Lucas could see the difference now, the slight hesitation before certain details, the way his gaze shifted briefly toward the doors before returning, as if checking whether something inside might contradict what he was saying. Inside the room, the atmosphere remained focused but no longer neutral, every movement now carried awareness, every note documented with care, and Lucas stayed close. Not interfering, not directing, but present in a way that made it clear he was not leaving this story unfinished. Emily's breathing steadied further, the rhythm still assisted but no longer fragile in the same way, and the second heartbeat on the monitor held strong, a quiet, steady reminder of what was at stake beyond the immediate moment. Lucas watched her closely, noticing the subtle changes that others might overlook, the way her brow tightened slightly when certain voices were heard, the way her breathing shifted when the doors opened, small reactions that formed a pattern if you paid attention long enough. Then the doors slid open again, and for a brief second, Daniel stepped closer than before, not entering, not crossing the boundary, but near enough that his presence could be felt inside the room, and in that moment, Emily's reaction was immediate. Her breathing faltered, not dramatically, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to break the rhythm she had just regained. Lucas saw it clearly, the connection forming in real time, and he moved without hesitation, stepping slightly to adjust the line of sight, placing himself between her and the doorway just enough to shift her focus back toward him, towards something steady, something safe. "You are okay," he said again, his voice calm, controlled, and within seconds her breathing began to settle, the pattern returning, the tension easing just enough to confirm what he had just witnessed. Outside, Daniel stepped back again, his expression tightening before smoothing over, but the moment had already passed. Already been seen, and Lucas did not need anything more to understand what that reaction meant. A nurse exchanged a glance with the attending physician, a silent communication that required no words, and within moments, a decision was made, quiet but firm, restricting access further, ensuring that no one entered without direct approval, and the message was clear even without being spoken aloud. Back inside. Emily's hand moved again, slower this time, weaker, but still deliberate, and Lucas stayed where he was, allowing that small connection to remain, because now it was more than reassurance, it was confirmation that her body was responding not just to treatment, but to presence, to proximity, to something beyond the physical. And as the room settled into this new, controlled state, Lucas felt the final piece fall into place, not as a dramatic realization, but as a quiet certainty that carried more weight than any assumption, because now there was a pattern, now there was response, and whatever truth Emily had been trying to bring back with her from that silence was no longer hidden, it was unfolding, step by step, in ways that could not be ignored. By the time the next set of questions reached Daniel Whitmore, the tone had shifted from concern to precision, not aggressive, not accusatory, but structured in a way that left less room for interpretation, and Lucas Reed watched from inside the room as the conversation unfolded. Through the glass, every movement now carrying a different kind of weight. The hospital administrator stood beside the security officer, asking Daniel to walk through the timeline again, this time slower, this time with specific markers, what time he last saw Emily conscious, what time he placed the call, what exactly he observed in those moments, and Daniel complied, his voice steady at first, but as the details narrowed, small inconsistencies began to surface, not dramatic contradictions. Just slight shifts in phrasing, pauses where there had been none before, answers that felt adjusted rather than recalled. Inside, Emily's condition continued to stabilize in careful increments, the monitors reflecting a fragile but consistent return to balance, and Lucas remained close, not just as a witness but as a point of reference, because every time her awareness surfaced, it found him again. As if his presence had become the one constant in a situation where everything else had shifted. A nurse adjusted the equipment gently, speaking in a calm tone meant to reassure, and Emily's eyes opened once more, clearer now, holding focus longer than before, and Lucas saw the effort behind it, the determination to stay present even as exhaustion pulled at her. "You are in the hospital," he said quietly, reinforcing what mattered most, and her gaze locked onto his again, this time with something new beneath it, not just confusion or fear, but recognition, the kind that comes when a memory begins to connect with reality. Her lips moved, slower but more controlled than before, and Lucas leaned in, listening carefully, because now the pattern was undeniable. She was trying to communicate something specific, something that had not yet been fully spoken. The sound that followed was still faint, still incomplete, but it carried more clarity than any attempt before, enough to form a partial name, enough to point outward again. And Lucas did not need the full word to understand what she meant, because outside the glass, the same presence remained, the same figure waiting, the same tension holding steady. At that exact moment, the door opened again, and one of the staff members stepped out to speak directly with Daniel, informing him that access would remain restricted for the time being, that further information would be gathered before any visits could be allowed, and for the first time, Daniel's reaction did not fully align with the situation. His response coming just a fraction too quickly, his insistence just slightly too firm, asking why, asking what had changed, and Lucas saw it clearly, the shift from control to pressure, subtle but unmistakable. Back inside, Emily's breathing wavered again for a brief second, not enough to alarm, but enough to confirm the connection once more, and Lucas adjusted his position instinctively, restoring that line of calm, that presence she had begun to rely on, and within moments, her rhythm steadied again, as if guided by something she trusted more than the voices beyond the room. The attending physician exchanged a quiet glance with the nurse, and another note was added to the chart, another observation documented, because now it was no longer just about what had happened physically, it was about how her body responded to specific conditions, to specific people, to specific moments. Lucas straightened slightly. his focus shifting between the bed and the hallway, between the present and the growing understanding of what had led here, and for the first time since the call came in, the uncertainty that had followed him began to take shape, not as a guess, not as a theory, but as a sequence, a series of connected reactions that pointed towards something real, something that would not stay hidden much longer, because now there were too many witnesses, too many patterns, and one woman who had come back just long enough to make sure the truth did not disappear with her. The air outside the trauma bay had changed in a way that no one announced but everyone felt, a quiet tightening of control, a shift from questions to verification, and Lucas Reed could see it in the way the hospital administrator now stood closer to Daniel Whitmore, not blocking him, not accusing him, but no longer giving him the same open space he had before. The questions continued, more precise now. Asking about exact minutes, about the sequence between calling for help and attempting assistance, about details that seemed small but carried weight when placed side by side, and Daniel answered them all, his voice still measured, but the rhythm had changed, the pauses longer, the certainty thinner, as if each answer required more construction than memory. Inside the room, Emily Whitmore's awareness continued to rise in small, deliberate steps, her eyes opening fully for the first time since her arrival. Holding steady despite the fatigue pressing against them, and Lucas stayed within her line of sight, because every time she surfaced, she returned to that same anchor, that same point of calm in a space filled with motion. "You are doing well," he said quietly, not offering promises, only stability, and her gaze remained fixed on him, stronger now, clearer, as if she was beginning to reconnect the pieces of what had happened and where she was now. Her lips moved again, slower, controlled, and this time the sound that followed was not fragmented, not uncertain, but shaped enough to carry meaning, a name, unmistakable even in its softness, and Lucas did not need to ask who she meant, because outside the glass, the same figure shifted again, his composure tightening as another staff member approached with a different tone, one that no longer sounded like routine clarification but like the beginning of something formal. A quiet request was made for Daniel to remain available for further discussion, to stay within a designated area, and though the words were polite, the structure behind them was firm, leaving little room for interpretation, and Daniel nodded, but the agreement came with a subtle tension, a stiffness that had not been there before. Inside, Emily's breathing held steady even as the name left her lips, not faltering this time, not breaking the rhythm, and Lucas recognized the difference immediately. Because now her response was not triggered by fear or proximity. It was driven by intention, by the need to be understood. A nurse stepped closer with a small notepad, documenting the moment carefully, the clarity of her speech, the timing, the context, every detail now part of a record that extended beyond medical care. Lucas glanced briefly toward the hallway, where the presence of security had become more defined, more structured. And he understood what was happening without needing it explained. The situation had crossed a line, and once crossed, it did not return to where it began. Emily's hand moved again, reaching slightly toward him, and he responded the same way as before, steady, present, allowing that connection to remain without drawing attention to it, because now it was more than reassurance, it was confirmation that she was aware, that she was choosing what to say, and that what she was saying mattered. Outside, Daniel's posture shifted once more as he was guided a few steps further down the hall, not forced, not restrained, but directed in a way that made it clear the environment was no longer his to control, and for a brief moment, his gaze moved back toward the room, toward the place where everything had begun to unravel. Lucas followed that glance for just a second before returning his focus to Emily, because the direction of the story had already changed. And whatever came next would not depend on assumptions or impressions, it would depend on what had already been seen, already been heard, and now, finally, beginning to be understood. The hallway lights seemed brighter now, not because they had changed, but because the tension had sharpened everyone's awareness, and Lucas Reed could feel the shift settle into something irreversible as two additional officials arrived, their presence calm but unmistakably purposeful, speaking quietly with the hospital administrator before turning their attention toward Daniel Whitmore, who stood a few steps away. His posture composed but no longer relaxed. The conversation that followed was Low in volume but precise in tone, each question measured, each response observed, and though no one raised their voice, the distance between what was being asked and what was being answered had begun to close in a way that left little room for interpretation. Inside the room, Emily Whitmore remained steady, her breathing even, her awareness no longer drifting but holding firm, and Lucas stayed beside her, aware that every second now mattered not just medically, but factually, because what she could communicate in these moments would carry weight far beyond the walls of the hospital. Her eyes found his again, not searching this time, not uncertain, but deliberate, and when she spoke, the effort was still visible, but the clarity had grown, each word forming with more strength than before, enough to complete what had only been fragments earlier, enough to leave no confusion about who she was referring to. And Lucas listened without interruption, his expression steady, his focus absolute, because this was no longer about interpretation, this was confirmation. A nurse standing nearby wrote quickly, capturing every word, every pause, every detail, while the attending physician stepped closer, observing not just the content of her speech but the stability that accompanied it, because there was no spike in distress now, no break in rhythm, only a controlled, intentional delivery that aligned with everything they had already begun to suspect. Outside, Daniel's composure shifted again, subtle but visible, as one of the officials asked him to clarify a specific part of his earlier statement, a detail about timing that no longer aligned cleanly with the information being gathered, and for the first time, his response did not come immediately, the silence stretching just long enough to be noticed. Just long enough to change the tone of the entire exchange. Lucas caught a glimpse of that moment through the glass, the hesitation, the recalculation, and then he looked back at Emily, because what mattered most was not what was being adjusted outside, but what was being established inside, and she was still looking at him, still present, still holding on to the thread of communication that had brought everything into focus. Her hand tightened slightly around his, not in fear, but in emphasis, as if to anchor the final piece of what she needed to say, and when she spoke again, it was quieter, but complete, a statement rather than a fragment, and the room seemed to hold its breath for a fraction of a second as the meaning settled into place. The nurse finished writing and stepped back, the physician nodded once, and without raising his voice, he gave a quiet instruction that moved the situation forward, because now there was enough to act, enough to transition from observation to response. Outside, Daniel was asked to remain where he was, the language still controlled, still professional, but the structure behind it unmistakable, and the hallway that had once been open now felt defined by invisible lines that could not be crossed. Lucas remained beside Emily, his presence unchanged, his focus steady, but the understanding between them had shifted into something deeper, something final, because she had done what she needed to do, she had stayed, she had spoken, and she had made sure that what happened would not be reduced to silence or confusion. And as the sound of measured footsteps echoed softly down the corridor, the outcome that had once seemed uncertain now moved forward with quiet, undeniable direction. No one announced the turning point, but it arrived in the quietest possible way, in the form of a single nod exchanged between the attending physician and the lead official standing just outside the room, a silent agreement that what had been uncertain minutes ago had now crossed into clarity, and Lucas Reed felt it immediately, not through words, but through the stillness that followed, the kind of stillness that only comes when a situation stops unfolding and starts concluding. Inside, Emily Whitmore remained conscious, her breathing steady, her focus no longer drifting but anchored. And the strength it took to reach this moment showed in the way her eyes stayed open despite the exhaustion pressing against them, in the way her hand remained lightly wrapped around Lucas's, not gripping, not reaching, but holding, as if to confirm that she was still here, still present, still in control of her voice. The nurse stepped forward again, this time not to ask questions, but to confirm what had already been recorded, reading back key details in a calm, measured tone, allowing Emily to respond with the smallest movements, a blink, a slight nod, each one carrying the weight of confirmation, each one turning what had been spoken into something undeniable. Lucas stayed silent, understanding that his role had shifted from witness to support, from observation to presence, and he did not move, because every second of stability mattered, Every moment of calm reinforced the truth that had just been established. Outside, the hallway had taken on a different shape, no longer open, no longer fluid, but structured, controlled. And Daniel Whitmore now stood within that structure, not restrained, not touched, but clearly no longer free to move as he had before, as the officials spoke with him in tones that remained professional but no longer flexible, their questions now replaced with statements, their requests now framed as requirements. For a brief moment, his gaze lifted toward the glass again, toward the room where everything had shifted beyond his reach, and there was something in that glance that had not been there earlier, not confusion, not anger, but realization, the quiet understanding that whatever control he believed he had was gone. Back inside, the physician gave a final instruction to the team, initiating the next phase of care, one that prioritized recovery now that immediate stability had been secured, and the machines around Emily continued their steady rhythm, no longer fluctuating, no longer reacting, but holding a consistent line that reflected the progress she had fought to achieve. Lucas exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he had been holding, and for the first time since the call had come in, the urgency that had driven every second began to ease, replaced not by relief, but by certainty, because what needed to be seen had been seen, what needed to be said had been said, and what needed to be understood was now clear. Emily's eyes closed for a moment, not in distress, but in rest, a controlled release after holding herself present for longer than anyone could have expected. And when they opened again, there was a quiet steadiness in them, a calm that did not erase what had happened, but proved that she had moved through it. The room remained quiet, the kind of quiet that follows resolution rather than precedes it, and as the sound of footsteps in the hallway shifted from movement to position, from motion to presence, it became clear that what had begun as an emergency had transformed into something else entirely, something that would not fade, not be explained away, not be forgotten, because in a space built to save lives, one woman had also made sure the truth survived with her. Morning light filtered softly through the hospital windows, turning the sharp edges of the night into something quieter, something almost distant, but not erased, because what had happened here did not belong to darkness or light, it belonged to truth, and truth had a way of staying. Emily Whitmore rested now, her breathing steady, her condition stable, the machines around her no longer carrying urgency but rhythm. And Lucas Reed stood just outside the room, no longer needed at her side every second, but not ready to leave either, because some moments do not end when the crisis passes, they end when understanding settles, and that had only just begun. Down the hallway, the controlled movement of officials continued, measured, deliberate, and Daniel Whitmore was no longer at the center of attention by choice, but by process. Guided step by step through a sequence that had been set into motion long before he realized it, his voice no longer carrying the same authority it once did, now reduced to responses, to acknowledgments, to the quiet reality of consequences forming in real time. Inside, a nurse adjusted Emily's blanket with careful precision, the kind of small, human gesture that marked the return to normal care, and when Emily opened her eyes again, there was no confusion this time, no searching, only awareness, calm and grounded, as if she had crossed through something and come out on the other side with nothing left to prove. The physician spoke softly, outlining the next steps, recovery, observation, time, each word practical, each step necessary, but beneath it all was an unspoken recognition that her strength had done more than sustain her body. It had preserved something far less visible and far more important. Lucas watched for a moment longer, then finally stepped back, giving space not out of distance, but out of respect, because this was no longer about holding the moment together, it was about allowing it to stand on its own. Further down the corridor, the final pieces of the situation aligned quietly, paperwork exchanged, statements noted, procedures followed, nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just the steady, irreversible movement of accountability taking shape, and Daniel's gaze, once fixed forward with certainty, now shifted more often, less steady, as if searching for something that no longer existed. The hospital returned to its natural rhythm, footsteps echoing, voices low, doors opening and closing, but beneath that rhythm, this night remained, recorded not just in reports and charts, but in the memory of those who had witnessed it, in the way a room had held tension and then released it. In the way a single voice had carried through uncertainty and turned it into clarity. Emily's eyes closed again. This time not from exhaustion alone, but from a quiet acceptance that the hardest part had passed, and somewhere beyond the walls of that room, beyond the reach of influence or wealth, the outcome continued to unfold without noise, without spectacle, just direction. Lucas took one last look before turning away, the sound of his footsteps fading into the corridor. And the story that had begun with confusion and control ended not with confrontation, but with something far more permanent, a quiet, undeniable balance restored, because some men spend their lives building power, only to discover too late that it cannot stand against the weight of a woman who refused to let her truth disappear.